Have you ever been sitting in a meeting and thinking to yourself, why am I here? Or even worse, got to the end of the meeting and thought, this is an hour of my life I'm never going to get back. If you've had that, you're not alone. I've had that feeling myself. In fact, I had that feeling recently. I was in a meeting, got to the end of the meeting, had those feelings, and the meeting leader came to me afterward and said, I bet you thought that was a waste of your time. And I thought to myself, yeah. And I thought also, if I say that out loud, I'm going to get myself in trouble. And then I thought, well, I'm a meeting scientist and I'm curious about what he's going to say next. So I said, yeah, kinda. He then proceeded to tell me why I was there, and then asked me specific questions about the things that were going on in the meeting and wanted my opinion about it. That never happens. In fact, it was such an oddity for me as a meeting scientist that it's a memory of a meeting experience that I just have never had ever again. Over the 20 years that I've studied meetings, people ask me lots of questions. How do I make my meetings better, et cetera, all sorts of different things. One thing that people ask me is, why do you study meetings, Joe? And the answer that I've come to over that time is that meetings aren't bad. Rather, we as humans, as people who work in organizations, are kind of bad at meeting. But we don't have to be, even though the scope of the issue might be a little bit overwhelming. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there are millions of meetings every single day in the United States. And if you look at your calendar, you're probably not surprised by that, right? In fact, most workers, will have 4 or 5 meetings per day or more on their calendar. In fact, managers in large organizations spend 75% of their time on meeting-related activities. That's a ton of time. And when you think about that, in combination with the other work that they have to do, it's no wonder it's overwhelming. And a few years ago, we saw a major surge in meetings, not least of which because of this little bug, COVID-19. And just before that pandemic, I was invited along with a friend, Karen Reed, to record a webinar. And in that webinar, we were supposed to talk about the future of meetings. Me as a meeting scientist and her as a communication and scholar and media person. And as we talked about it, we talked about how in about 5 years, there'd be this transition from these face-to-face environments that we often found ourselves in to more virtual meetings where we'd have more Teams meetings and more Zoom meetings, that sort of thing. Which seems pretty reasonable, right, in 5 years. That webinar was recorded on March 7th, 2020. 1 week later, everything we said happened. It was abrupt, it was substantial, it was immediate, and it resulted in a lot more meetings. And that's when we realized that, and me and my team started to wonder about, okay, if meeting load is increasing by hundreds of percent, thousands of percent, we realized meeting load, or the number of meetings people have in a given day, and the amount of time they spend in meetings was going to be really important for understanding how people feel about work. And so we started to do some studies. And in one study that I did with a few colleagues, we found a little bit of a paradox. We called it the meeting load paradox. What we found was that as you have more meetings, people tend to perform better. They tend to solve their problems more creatively. They participate more both in their meetings and in their work. It's wonderful. These are amazing benefits to having more meetings. But then we identified this paradox that emerged. The relationship was an inverted U relationship, meaning that, at the beginning you get this engagement increase, you get this creative problem solving, you get participation. And then as you start having more meetings, you start seeing the opposite. It flips the script. You start seeing reductions in all of those things, and even increases in burnout because of all the meetings, right? That's a problem. So, what's the answer? The answer is, meetings are not bad. Rather, we as humans are not really great at meeting. And what happens is, because we're not very good at it, we push ourselves right over the top of that hump into the bad as we keep having more and more meetings thinking that's the answer to our engagement and performance issues. But there's some good news here. Meetings don't have to be bad. They can be optimized for success. They really can be very good. So over the years doing meeting science and by many others, including myself, studying meetings, trying to understand how do we make these things better, we found about 30 things. 30 things that are practices that people should be engaging in to really make their meetings much more efficient, more effective than ever before. And that's a lot of things, right? Well, there's some good news there, or sort of some news. Basically, the typical person does 10 to 15 of those things. Okay? So our meetings are generally okay. They're not great, but they're okay. So what that really means is that we need to engage in some reflection and then some action. In that reflection, what we need to figure out is, what are we doing that's working? And write that down. And then, what are we doing that's not working? Probably should still write that down and then stop doing those things. And then reflect on, what are some meaningful, simple practices that I could start doing right now? Okay? What are the common sense practices that are not commonly practiced that I could do today? Now, to help think about this, you got to change your mindset when it comes to how you approach meetings. Rather than seeing meetings as this thing, this singular unit of interaction between you and others, you have to think about a meeting as having three parts. Okay? Things that happen before the meeting, things that should be happening, practices happening during the meeting, and things that should be done after the meeting. And if you view it as these three phases, it becomes more meaningful, and you're more able to then identify what are these practices that you should be trying to do before, during, and after these phases, right? To help with that, let's talk about those a little bit. Before the meeting, you should probably identify what is the purpose of the meeting and communicate that, right? Whether that be through a formal agenda or just adding a line on the calendar invite and hitting send, so that way people know what they're walking into. During the meeting, we should probably encourage people to participate broadly. We should be encouraging them. You invited them there for a reason. You ought to let them say something. But at the same time, we need to minimize or reduce counterproductive meeting behaviors, like complaining or that multitasking that derails us, and they're off doing something else, and we have to say, hey, Joe, what about this? And Joe's like, oh, you were cutting out, when they really weren't cutting out, right? And then after the meeting, you need to identify the action items. Make sure those action items are assigned to someone and embed follow-up throughout the meeting or throughout the regular working activities that week. So that way, the next time you have a meeting with that group, it's not the same as the last one. Anybody ever had the repeat meeting every week with the same group? Recreating those action items again and again and again? Right. Okay. So the key here is recognizing that there are three different phases that need to be managed and led as opposed to just happening. Now, you might be thinking, and I've had people tell me many times, that 30 things is a lot of things. And how do I get started? In fact, a few years ago, I had a client reached out to me and said, we really want to make our meetings better, but we're so overloaded with meetings, we don't even know where to start. And they wanted to embed some of those good practices into their processes, but they couldn't do it because they were busy having meetings. They just didn't have a way to do it. So they asked, can you figure out a way to help us reduce the meeting load so that way we could then attack the issues that we're dealing with? So I said, sure, let's do something simple. Let's start with 2 questions. And so I said, let's take a 2-question approach to reducing your meeting load. And what I want to do is I'm going to teach you and your teams to ask these 2 questions of yourselves before you hit send on those meeting invites, okay? So question number 1, does that meeting have a purpose? If yes, proceed to question number 2. If no, stop. Don't schedule the meeting. There's no reason to have a meeting that has no purpose. Question number 2, does that purpose require collaboration? If yes, proceed to schedule the meeting because you're expecting to have dialogue, conversation. You're going to generate ideas. Whatever it is, it's something that requires you to communicate with other people. If no, don't schedule a meeting. You don't need a meeting. You just need a better way to communicate that information. And we have lots of different ways, lots of different channels for getting information out to the team, out to the people who need to hear that information, okay? That 2-question approach over the course of 6 weeks reduced their meeting load by 10%. And then they were able to start implementing some of those best practices to help them actually have more positive experiences with their meetings. Now, let's be honest. We probably all should be implementing that 2-question process, right? And by doing that, we'd start to have a little more breathing room, hopefully, to be able to implement the good practices. But the other thing that you'll probably quickly recognize, and that we started to recognize in our research, was that the 10 to 15 things that you do are different than probably the 10 to 15 things that I do regularly, which are different than the 10 to 15 things that someone else does, right? That's why this almost always has to be down to the individual, right? Each person has to reflect and look at before, during, and after and figure out what are the things that I can do. Or if you're struggling with that, that's okay. Have someone you know who you admire, who is good at meetings or has done well, and have them come to one of your meetings and give you some feedback afterwards. The key to remember here is that meetings are not bad. We're just not great at doing them. But we can be, because this is not rocket science, everybody. This is meeting science, and you're the scientist. Thank you.